Hi you guys, and welcome back to another true crime and makeup time video. If you're new here, my name is Zara and I post a new true crime video every single week. So if you love makeup and you love true crime, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more videos from me. And yeah, leave a comment below letting me know what you want to see next. If you have any case suggestions, I love when you guys send some really interesting case suggestions for me. Today's case is so interesting. I feel like you guys are really gonna, well, I don't want to say enjoy this case, but I feel like you guys are gonna find this interesting. Today's case was actually requested by Suzette. So thank you so much, Suzette, for introducing me to this case. I can't believe I've never, ever heard about it. I've never heard about it. When I saw the suggestion, Mr. Cruel, in my comments, I was like, Mr. Cruel? Literally never heard of that. So I was like, he's from Australia. I'm like, I need to know. So let's get into the case. It's pretty crazy. So who was Mr. Cruel? And I've never heard of him, but apparently he was an unknown man known as Mr. Cruel, and he committed a series of horrific crimes in Melbourne, Australia between the late 80s, early 90s. He was a masked attacker who broke into the homes of Australian families, bound the parents, and assaulted the children. He is responsible for the abduction and sexual assault of 3 girls between the ages of 10 and 13, and also the murder of a 13-year-old girl in 1991. He committed his crimes wearing a black ski mask, which means that none of his victims could ever provide any identifying descriptions about his face. The only sort of image we have of Mr. Cruel is when law enforcement depicted a sketch of his face, and that itself alone is terrifying. And I believe he was known as Mr. Cruel because it seemed that the planning of each of his attacks was meticulously planned out, and then he would also kind of lie or trick his victims into believing that he was only there to rob them. And, you know, they had that false hope that it was just going to be a robbery and then leave everyone alone, but then he would do horrible things to the children. And he was also known to plant red herrings at the crime scene. Okay, so let's get into the first attack. So on August 22nd, 1987, a masked man, an intruder, broke into the home in a suburb in Lower Plenty, Melbourne. It was a quiet suburb on the outskirts of Melbourne, at around 4 a.m. by removing a glass pane from a window. So once he was inside, he had a knife and a gun as his weapons, and he forced the parents into a wardrobe. And before he did that, he bound their hands and feet. And they had a 6-year-old son, and he was also tied to his own bed using surgical tape. So the parents' hands and feet were bound, and then they were shoved into a wardrobe. And then the 6-year-old son was bound to his bed using surgical tape. The one he was really there for, so the victim, well, the main victim in the crime, was their 11-year-old daughter. And he sexually assaulted this 11-year-old girl for 2 hours in the same home until he left with like a blue coat and some vinyl records. And he never left any clues behind, but he took these 2 items and we don't know why. Can you imagine being the parents stuck inside the wardrobe, hearing your 11-year-old daughter scream and cry for help, if she did, which I'm guessing she did, while a freaking intruder was assaulting her? Like, I can't even imagine what that must have been like for this family. And this little girl was never identified, obviously, just for, safety reasons. After this twisted attack on this family, the police were obviously called, and then they began their investigation. And then that first sort of image of Mr. Cruel was depicted from the family's description of him. And the scary thing is that essentially because he got away with this first crime on that Australian, winter morning in 1987, Mr. Cruel essentially became like the boogeyman for Australia or Melbourne residents. And he would strike fear into parents and children all over town for over a decade. He set out on a sadistic abduction spree, but no one could stop Mr. Cruel because no one knew who he was. So in their investigation, the parents, they told the detectives that once the intruder, he detached the window pane the glass panel from a window pane in the living room. He made his way to the parents' bedroom with his knife and gun in hand. And to subdue them, he used a knot to bind their hands and feet. But the knot that he used was complicated and something that only a sailor or someone with nautical experience would know how to do. And then after, binding the parents' hands and feet and binding their 6-year-old son to his bed, he, raped their 11-year-old daughter over the course of 2 hours while the family was just trapped. This little girl was eventually able to tell police that during one of the breaks he took in attacking her over that period of 2 hours, he used the family telephone to call someone. And from what the girl heard, it was a threatening phone call he was making to someone else. And he was sort of demanding the person on the phone to move their children and, leave the area they were in or they would be next. And he kept referring to the person on the phone as Bozo. So police, based on this information, they go and they check the phone lines to try and recover the number that, this intruder was calling. But there was no record of this call whatsoever. So they kind of think that this was fake and he did this to just plant sort of a clue without leaving a real clue. And this was his first red herring that he would begin leaving at his crime scenes to confuse investigators. But realistically, in doing this, he would throw them off his scent for years. It was over a year before Mr. Cruel struck again. I guess that first crime kept him pretty happy for that period of time. Then on 27th December 1998, just a few days after Christmas, John Wills and his wife, they were just sleeping in their Ringwood area home, and they had 4 daughters and everyone was just asleep. And their home was in the suburb of Ringwood, which was only a few miles away from that first crime. So the crimes really weren't that far apart. At 5:45 a.m., wearing dark blue overalls and a black or dark ski mask, Mr. Cruel breaks into this home and he holds a gun to John Wills, the father's head. He told John not to be a hero and he bound John and his wife with copper wire. And as before, he clutched a knife, would make the parents roll onto their stomachs so he could bind them, and then he would gag them. Again, he tells the parents, "I'm only here for money." So the father, John, he takes Mr. Cruel. This is before he obviously bound him. He takes him to his bedside table and goes, "There's some money in here." And there was $35 on the bedside table. Mr. Cruel takes that money, and I'm guessing John was like, "Okay, well, you got some money." And then he binds and gags them, and then he methodically goes and cuts the phone lines before he makes his way into the 4 daughters' bedrooms. So he goes into this bedroom, and then he addresses the 10-year-old daughter, Sharon Wills, by her name. And at the time, Sharon, she could obviously probably hear what was going on outside. She was pretending to sleep, but he quickly woke her, and then he bound and gagged her. And then he grabbed a few items of her clothing, and then he fled the house with her early that morning. And no one knew where he took her. Now, Sharon was known to be super quiet, super sweet, and she actually sang with the Victorian choir, which is pretty big. She had appeared on TV with the choir just weeks before the attack, and then a couple of weeks before the attack, she was also in the newspaper because her mother, Julie, saved her from a house fire where a blanket caught on fire. So that article was also in the newspaper. So Sharon's face was in the newspaper or in the media a couple times prior to her attack. So he called Sharon by name. So does that mean he knew Sharon? He was stalking her? Did he see her before? And that seems likely, doesn't it? Around 15 minutes after Mr. Cruel had already left, John Wills, the father, he managed to free himself, and he quickly noticed that the phone lines were cut. I'm guessing he tried to make a phone call, and then when he went into his daughter's rooms, he noticed that Sharon was missing. So he rushed over to the neighbor's house to use their phones to call the police, And then he ran through the neighborhood, searching for his daughter. However, at this point, assuming, Mr. Cruel had a car and he had taken Sharon, they were long gone. The two of them were gone by this point. 18 hours later, a woman, she stumbles across a tiny little figure standing on a street corner just after midnight. And this little figure was dressed in green garbage bags. And it was Sharon Wills. Sharon was immediately taken to hospital and reunited with her family. And she gave police some startling clues as to who her attacker could really be. And I mean, this must have been so difficult. She was only 10. Can you imagine how difficult that would have been to not only survive this freaking attack, but then having to relive it and explain everything? That would have been insane. The details she gave was pretty crazy. So Sharon said that she went for a long drive with this man where he took her to a house and then blindfolded and gagged her again. And she was blindfolded and gagged for the entire time she was being assaulted. She said she never saw his face, and even though he was assaulting her, there were times where he was kind and soft and gentle. He fed her a sandwich, he gave her some milk and some lemonade. While she was held captive, she managed to peek through her blindfolds or pulled it down, and she took note of her surroundings, and she noticed at the bed she was on, there was a camera at the end of the bed. What a sicko. She could also describe his bedroom and bathroom, which I'll try and put an image here. She described the house being on a quiet street and that the driveway was on the right side of the house. For a 10-year-old to know these kinds of things, that's pretty incredible. Sharon also said she repeatedly heard the sound of low-flying aircrafts, which the police deduced that he probably lived close to an airport, which was Tullamarine Airport, where he was in direct flight path of planes landing. Because Sharon was blindfolded through the entire assault, she wasn't able to give a physical description of Mr. Cruel, but she was able to tell police that before he let her go, he gave her a full, thorough bath. He not only washed off any potential forensic evidence, but he also clipped her fingernails, he clipped her toenails, he brushed her teeth, he flossed her freaking teeth. He also got rid of all her clothes and he slipped her into those garbage bags. And this was also meticulously done. These garbage bag outfit was so precise. So he put one garbage bag over her and then he taped it over her upper body. Then he put another garbage bag over her lower half, taped it on her lower body. And then he put a white men's shirt over the top of that. And then he sent her, free in the streets. And come on, that is so methodical and planned out. He must have really thought about this. But then the men's shirt, that's kind of evidence, right? So I wonder whatever came with that, but I guess they didn't find anything, in relation to that. Sharon's father actually really suffered after the attack because he just had tremendous guilt. He was just wishing that he could protect his daughter better and he could have done something, helped her to even just avoid her from experiencing that. The family, after the attack, they all slept in one room together, all 6 of them, and they increased security in their home. And police actually patrolled their street for a little while to make sure that Mr. Cruel never came back. I mean, how do you live in the same home? I'm pretty sure I would have moved. There's no chance I would be living in that home. There is 0 chance. Bye. I'm gone. Then investigators quickly tied this attack to the previous one in Lower Plenty. And now people are starting to freak out in the Melbourne suburbs. They're like, oh man, there's 2 attacks now and they were so far apart, time-wise. So it's how do you prepare for this? How do you plan for this? You can't. It's up to Mr. Cruel. Kids would have nightmares. Parents didn't want to leave their kids alone. And even with babysitters, they just didn't want to leave the kids with anyone but them. And I mean, how long can you actually live like this, worried and in fear? But the fact that his attacks, these 2 attacks were so far apart, it's how long are you really supposed to be afraid for the next year before the next attack? It's crazy. So Mr. Cruel then strikes for a 3rd time, but this time he did it on July 3rd, 1990, which is 2 years later, which it's a good thing because it would be better than, you know, it happening every month and so many victims. But at the same time, it's like you are just on edge for like years. He's not doing it enough to get caught, you know? So this third attack took place in the suburb of Canterbury, which is like west of the previous suburbs of Ringwood and Lower Plenty. And the home that he attacked this time was that of the Linus family. And they were an English family and they were pretty well off. And they had been renting this home on this really prestigious street, Monomeath Avenue. And this area at the time had been home to plenty of Australian politicians and officials. So people believed that this was kind of like a secure and, you know, safe area. On that day, the parents, Brian and Rosemary Linus, were attending a farewell party because they were leaving Australia to move back to England. They were literally days away from leaving this place. So because they were at a farewell party, they left their 2 daughters alone at home. And I know some of you may be thinking, like, why would you leave your daughters at home if you know these attacks are taking place? But like I said before, this guy, he waits so long in between his attacks. It's almost like he wants people to forget about him so then he can like strike again. You know what I mean? It's kind of crazy. This time it had been nearly 2 years since his attack, like at least a year and a half. So people, either they forgot or they were just hoping that he was done, you know? So at 11:40 p.m. on 3rd July 1990, and this time he also chooses a different time to attack people. Before it was early in the morning. This time it was 11:40 p.m. just before midnight. So just before midnight, the 2 sisters, 13-year-old Nicola and then 15-year-old Fiona, they were awoken by like the rantings and ravings of this masked intruder who, as usual, wielded a gun and a knife. And he instructed the 13-year-old girl, Nicola, to go to her room and find her school uniform while he tied up her 15-year-old sister, Fiona, again, tied her to the bed. He takes Nicola's school uniform and a pair of underwear and he puts it into a bag. And I mean, like, hold on, she's already 13 and you need her to wear a school uniform. Like, doesn't the fact that she looks 13, isn't that enough for you? Like, this guy was like a true sicko. Mr. Cruel then informs Fiona that her father would need to pay $25,000 for Nicola's safe return. And then he takes off with Nicola in the family's rental vehicle, which was parked in the driveway. So he drives around in this car for 10 minutes until he parks it just 1 kilometer away down the road in Chaussee or Crescent. And then he moves her into a second vehicle, which I'm assuming was his car, and takes her to his house where he held her captive for 2 days this time. Like, it gets longer each time, you know? And just 20 minutes after Nicola's abduction, the 2 parents, Brian and Rosemary, they return from their farewell party and they find 15-year-old Fiona tied to her bed with a ransom note. Gagging Nicola, he held her captive for hours before releasing her at a power substation. Nicola had obviously been sexually assaulted, and just like Sharon, she had also been given food and drinks. And the Mr. Cruel, he also made her brush her teeth and he cleaned her extensively. And then 2 days after her attack on 5th July 1990, Nicola was dropped off at an electricity station, like a substation, in a suburb called Kew, which is not far from her home. And she was fully dressed. She was wrapped in a blanket, but her eyes, they were taped shut. When she was confident that Mr. Cruel had driven away, she untapes her eyes, like she removes the tapes from her eyes. And after she removes, you know, these tapes from her eyes, she was freaking out, like made her way to a nearby home. And it was just after 2 a.m. when she phoned her parents from that home. Nicola, again, like so brave, she was only 13, was able to offer investigators some details about her 50 hours in captivity. Some of the most notable details she gave the police was that she could estimate the attacker's height to be around 5'8", and she also revealed that he possibly had reddish brown hair, which was new information. This helped compile an image of what Mr. Cruel could possibly be like. He was an Australian man between the ages of 30 and 50. He was between 173 to 180 centimeters tall, and he had a pot belly. His hair is believed to be like that reddish brown or like a fair sandy color, and he often used like words or terms like worrywart and bozo and missy. So, and remember from the first attack, when he pretended to make that phone call, he called someone bozo. So he had like this colloquial way of speaking. Some details of Nicola's ordeal were a little bit more upsetting or horrifying, I would say, where she said that the night that she was abducted, when he drove her in that car, once he switched cars after he drove her around in her parents' car for 10 minutes, he put her in his car and then he put this blanket over her head. And she says that they were driving for more than 45 minutes before they, arrived at the place, his home. And she said he had this large serrated kitchen knife, and she would peek through her blindfold and like observe parts of the home. She was forced to take a shower and be clean. And she states that for the entire time she was in captivity, that he had like this neck contraption fastened to his bed. So he would keep her in this neck contraption. So her neck was basically like trapped to the bed or stuck to the bed, so she couldn't move around. And this would also would restrain Nicola while she was being abused. And like, I can't even imagine that for 50 hours like that, and then not knowing every time you're going to be abused. Like, Nicola also states that she heard him speaking to another person, but she never heard this person actually respond back. So police, weren't entirely sure if there was actually an accomplice or if this was another, red herring that Mr. Cruel was leaving for the detectives to pretend like there was possibly someone else abusing or helping him. And police eventually just came to the conclusion that this was probably just a red herring to confuse everyone. I mean, these girls were really young, like they weren't there trying to figure out, are you trying to confuse me? Like, they were just taking in all the details. And it almost seems like he enjoyed releasing them so that like stories would come out about him and people would speculate who he was. You know what I mean? I think he really believed that he wouldn't get caught, and he was kind of right. So months after the Linus family, they ended up moving back to England. Nicola tells the police that she also heard low-flying aircrafts when she was at the home. And again, the fact that it was low-flying, they believed that he must be living in the direct flight path of the airport. But despite this, still, there wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest, and Mr. Cruel's next attack would be the worst to come. So now, less than a year later, on April 13th, 1991, Mr. Cruel broke into the home of John and Phyllis Chang in the affluent suburb of Templestowe in Victoria. And this family, they worked really hard to even live in that suburb. They worked really hard for their kids, and they worked really late nights at their restaurant. And that's how they were doing so well financially. Not only did they live, in that kind of nicer suburb, but they also had a few investment properties. So they were just working really hard, simple family, but they were doing really well and they were really happy. That night, they trusted their 13-year-old daughter, Carmen, to babysit their two younger daughters. And it seemed that Mr. Cruel knew this because, like I said before, he knew certain things about his victims and he wanted certain things. He had plans, like everything was meticulously planned out. Detectives believed that Mr. Cruel would stake out his victims for weeks or months and learn their habits and movements because there was months in between each crime. And it's almost like he enjoyed learning about his victims. Like he almost got to know them pretty well, knowing their habits, their routines, what they liked, what they didn't like, what they did every day. And then knowing he could just take that away from them, But I also think that's what made him so prepared during these attacks. He knew exactly where the telephone lines were. Maybe he, would go into the houses when everyone would leave and check out the area and the surroundings and how he could enter and which window panes were loose and things like that. And that's also how he was able to make his escape so swiftly because he just knew the area so well. He really studied each victim. And again, his attacks were getting earlier and earlier because that night on April 13th, he broke into the home of the Chans at 8:40 p.m., where Carmen and one of her sisters were actually in the kitchen. They were about to make some food, and they got scared by him in the kitchen where he was in his green tracksuit and his dark balaclava. He gets the 3 girls in one area and he tells them, "Look, I only want your money. Like, I want nothing else." Obviously lying. And then he tells Carmen, the 13-year-old, "I want you to come by yourself to show me exactly where the money is in the house." And he takes the 2 younger sisters into a bedroom, puts them in a closet, and then pushes the bed in front of the closet doors to trap the 2 younger sisters in there as he takes Carmen and he flees with her. And this happened at around 9:30 p.m. So he was in that home for like 45 minutes terrorizing these 3 girls, lying to them, telling them that he wanted nothing but money so that they, you know, maybe would cooperate a little bit better before he flees with Carmen. Only minutes later, the 2 younger sisters managed to push the wardrobe doors open, like push the bed away. And they immediately ran to the phone and they called their father, John, at the family restaurant. And they told him a man with a knife, he came and he's taken Carmen. John, you know, rushes home and he desperately searches for his daughter Carmen. But again, they were long gone. Like, they were probably gone for like an hour at this point, you know. But in true Mr. Cruel fashion, before actually leaving the home, he left a note on Mrs. Chan's car, spraying it with red spray paint. And it said something like, "Payback Asian drug dealer." And on the other side, it said, "More to come." But after combing through the family's background, you know, looking at John's background, Phyllis's background, the children, the family restaurant, they dug through everything. It proved to just be another red herring that Mr. Cruel was leaving because the family had no ties to drugs. And we're just a simple family just trying to make a living, you know? And by the time the police arrived, they knew exactly what they were expecting because they had been to enough of Mr. Cruel's crimes by this point, crime scenes, I mean, to know what had taken place and to know to look for a red herring. And so they had a sniffer dog come to pick up the scent. So the Chans, they lived on a corner block. So that means their house was here, and then they had a street running in front of the house and then a street at the side of the house, right? So then their house is right there. And a sniffer dog, he picks up a scent from the house. He follows the scent and he follows it to like the street that runs adjacent. So going this way, this one. So the front of the house is here. And this is where they, am I making sense? You know what I'm saying. So they pick up the scent on this street and the dog picks up the scent and then all of a sudden it runs out. So what they assumed is that this guy was parked pretty close to the house on this corner street and the scent went away because the guy, Mr. Cruel, must have had his car there and then he got in the car and then they drove off. So that's why the scent ended there. I hope that made sense because I made it way more complicated than it needed to be. Now, the interesting thing about this victim's family is that they were different to the rest. They really tried hard to get their daughter back. Like, not saying that the other victims didn't, because the other victims, they kind of came back fairly quickly. But this time, it was just different. And this poor family really suffered. So days later, the Chans, they posted this like encrypted letter in the newspaper using a cipher that like only Carmen Chan would be able to decrypt. And they offered $300,000 in exchange for Carmen's safe return. Carmen's abduction triggered one of the largest manhunts in Australia, and it was known as Operation Spectrum. It was a multi-million-dollar investigation. The police invested nearly $4 million into this investigation. They had tens of thousands of police man-hours, including like hours and hours and hours of volunteers looking for Carmen Chan. And not only looking for her, but trying to capture Mr. Cruel. Police questioned hundreds of motorists and handed out these like massive posters with Carmen's picture and details on it. And they actually sent these to 1.4 million homes in Australia, most of them in Victoria, but then they also sent it to some other states. They re-interviewed some of the previous victims, and then remember how a couple of the girls said that they heard low-flying planes? So they believed that it was near Tullamarine Airport, like the home where he would abduct everyone. So the police investigated and went door knocking on 30,000 homes around that area off the airport to match the inside descriptions of what the girls had given the police. And the sad ending to this case is that, unlike other victims, Carmen would never be returned home to her family. Nearly 1 year after Carmen's abduction on April 9th in 1992, a man, he was like walking his dog in like a suburb that was close by, a suburb called Thomastown, when he stumbled across a fully decomposed skeleton. So police get there, they take the evidence in, and later this skeleton was determined to be that of 13-year-old Carmen Chan. I think the insane thing is that when this autopsy was conducted, Carmen Chan had been shot 3 times, execution style, in the head, not long after her abduction. So I wonder what happened there. He had never done this before. And theories have like swirled about why Mr. Cruel did this to Carmen and not to anybody else, and what was the reason. Carmen's mother, Phyllis, believes that because her daughter was stubborn and she probably fought her attacker and possibly learned too much about him. Maybe she fought him to the point she took off her blindfold, she pulled his mask off. I mean, we don't know. Maybe she saw his face. That, yeah, she learned too much about him for him to let her go now. I saw this press conference video of Carmen's mother, well, both the parents, but Carmen's mother was holding up this t-shirt and begging for Carmen's life. Like, it's like so upsetting, because when you're a parent, even if you're not a parent, just to think of your own mother like begging like that for your life. I'll try and link the video down below, but the way she's begging for her daughter's life, you can see this has destroyed her. And I just started crying when I was doing my research, because it was just so sad to see, you know, like she just wanted her daughter back. This poor family, like they really tried to get their daughter back. They wrote letters to Mr. Cruel. The mother, Phyllis, wrote multiple letters, but the 2 daughters, like the younger sisters, they also wrote letters to Mr. Cruel. These letters were begging for Mr. Cruel to give their daughter back, their sister back, and they even offered Mr. Cruel, like, let's meet up here without police involvement, like we just want our daughter back. They tried to arrange like multiple ways without police involvement. And Phyllis even offered her own life in exchange for her daughter's life. She was like, take me, you can have me, but please just drop my daughter off somewhere, like, please. I wish I could read these letters to you guys, but the source that I found it on, like, just vanished. Like, you know, the link, it's like so annoying. It just vanished. And it won't give me access to that freaking letter anymore. So if one of you guys find it, can you leave it down below? Because maybe I need like a VPN or pay for like a subscription or something, because I really wanted to show it to you guys. But sadly, and almost luckily in a weird way, Carmen Chan's death marked the end of Mr. Cruel's reign of terror on Melbourne. After this, he fell off the radar, and it's believed that he never attacked again. Now, I think that he did this because he never actually planned to kill any of his victims. Maybe Carmen did fight back and fought really hard and maybe took off his mask, and that's never what his intention was. Maybe he was getting cocky. Maybe he was slipping, and she found out some information about him that would be possibly identifiable, and he couldn't set her free anymore. I mean, he had set every other victim free. He almost started in like intensities. Like he started with the first rape just at the house. Then the next one, he took her for 18 hours. And the next one, he took her for 2 days. And then this one, maybe he was planning on just taking her for a few more days, maybe a week. I mean, not that it's any better, but I really don't think he planned to kill her. Operation Spectrum continued for the next few years to try and catch Mr. Cruel. And it was a 40-member task force, and they investigated over 27,000 potential suspects. That's a lot. They arrested over 70 people and they collected tens of thousands of tips, and they searched over 30,000 homes in an attempt to find some information, catch him, anything. But they never did. Advancements in technology, including the ability to analyze the geographical locations of Mr. Cruel's crimes, can, I don't know, possibly help shed new light on the past crimes. I mean, they're all cold cases. Like I said before, given the carefully planned nature of Mr. Cruel's attacks, it's likely that he stalked and learned about his victims, for months. Carmen Chan's family home apparently was an 18-room large home, and it had 2-meter high fences, which in Australia, I'm pretty sure, I don't know about in the 90s, but right now you can have I think only if you're on a main road, you can do 2 meters or something like that. So it's the highest fences you can get. And she also had electric front gates. So it's likely that Mr. Cruel would have had to study that home very carefully to figure out how to gain access. I mean, electric front gates back in the 90s, wasn't that kind of a new thing? Police believe that examining contact points such as local schools, bus stops, tram stops, shops, libraries, things like that parks, can identify how he stalked his victims and where he learned about each of them, how he came into contact with them. I mean, did he just see them randomly and would set his eyes on each victim, or did he do his research? When I was researching this case, I came across this website that had each of the abduction sites, right? Each of the victims' abduction sites, and obviously which were all their homes. And then near their homes, this website put a map of contact areas of where Mr. Cruel could have potentially run across these victims. Around each home, there were heaps of parks, bus stops, couple of schools, shops, things like that. So multiple places where Mr. Cruel could have first seen his victims and then began his plan in stalking and ultimately committing these horrific crimes. The second victim, Sharon Wills, her parents were bound by copper wire, and at the time, copper wire was really hard to come across. So authorities believe that maybe he had access or was, an electrician or worked in a construction site where he would have easily come across the supply of copper wires. But then I feel like that could also be a type of a red herring, because one victim, he tied the son, I think, with surgical tape. So it's where'd you get surgical tape from, And another reason was each of the attacks happened close to or around the holidays. So then police were suspecting that perhaps he was a teacher or someone who worked in a school. According to an FBI report in 1991, they stated, the offender has an intense interest in children, especially children in the age group that he is assaulting. He will spend a great deal of time with these children in what appears to be selfless dedication to students. So didn't really understand that. I was I feel like he just likes children around those ages, but I don't know. He has an intense interest in their age. Of course he does. That's why he's abducting children that age, right? Criminal psychologist Tim Monroe, he's worked on Mr. Cruel's case. He believes that Mr. Cruel wasn't an exclusive pedophile, that prior to him, becoming infamous for these crimes against these children, that he had actually been active in Melbourne, that this criminal psychologist had been retained by Victoria Police to profile him and his crimes. And one of the crimes included rape and confinement of an elderly nun, where he then, after doing that, he blatantly took her car and her ATM card. He drives down to the local bank. He withdraws all her life savings, just cash. And then allegedly there were a number of other crimes that he committed, including the rape and detention of other adult women. So that's what that psychologist believes. They also noted that Mr. Cruel was so careful in never leaving his DNA. So he really took special note of that. And honestly, the fact that he never left any DNA is one of the reasons why he has never been caught. Operation Spectrum was eventually closed in 1994, and with it went any potential leads on the crimes. As of today, Mr. Cruel still remains one of Australia's most wanted criminals. And to this day, he still remains completely unidentified. No one knows who he is. Oh my God, like honestly, this one really freaks me out, especially because it's in my country. I feel like his name being Mr. Cruel is kind of hyped, but the actual sickness behind his crimes and how horrific his crimes really are were overlooked. I feel like even when I was telling the story, like you kind of downplay the crimes because you're just saying like what happened. But when you think about what he did to each of his victims, it's like really messed up. It's really bad, especially the fact if he was recording these little girls, like that means there are tapes out there of these little girls that hopefully no one will ever see apart from him, but one day they will be found. And that's the scary thing, you know, like one day these tapes, unless he destroys them, they will be uncovered. I'm glad that majority of the girls were released, but I mean, at this point, they're probably in their 40s and 50s. I mean, they're still living with it, knowing that Mr. Cruel knows their names and he's still out there. Another interesting thing about this case is that it did allow for a law to be established. Back in the 80s, sex offenders loitering around school grounds, stalking, and just hanging around those areas and school zones wasn't illegal. And it became illegal after this case. So you're telling me like prior to this law, sex offenders, especially who friggin' offended children, can just stand outside school zones just watching the children? Like that's okay? What were they thinking? Also, child pornography was not illegal. It became illegal after this case, possibly because the thought of the camera, you know, filming the children, abusing them. Well, tell me if you agree or disagree, but didn't like video cameras only begin to exist at this time? So maybe the law just never thought that people would actually film abusing children on video. You know what I mean? Like maybe that wasn't a thing yet. But wait, photos existed for a long time, right? So then were people taking photos of children? Scratch that. If you guys have never heard of this story before, let me know in the comments below. Thanks to Suzette again for recommending this case. What do you guys think of this case? Why do you think Mr. Cruel stopped? Do you think it was only because of Carmen's death and he didn't mean to kill her and he was kind of like, whoa, after that? He was like, dang, I don't mean to do that. Or do you think it was a coincidence? Like he was already planning to stop, which I don't think so. Do you think that he meant to kill any of his other victims and he just couldn't go through with it? Maybe it was the other way around. He wanted to kill everyone, but he just couldn't do it. And then Carmen was the one that he finally could do. And then he was like, oh no, what did I do? Does that make sense? And are you as scared as I am that he's still out there? Nope, just me? Okay. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you found today's video interesting. If you want to check out some of my other videos, click over here. And I will see you in the next one, guys. Besitos. Mwah. Bye.